Apollo 11, the first manned mission to the moon. Crewed by Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, the Apollo lunar module Eagle made global history on July the 20th, 1969. But is there more to their story than has been made public? Reports of a UFO sighting during the journey to the moon and the alleged secret radio transmissions between the crew and NASA are discussed in tonight's exciting episode.
Aliens Explored is a weekly podcast exploring famous and obscure cases of UFO sightings, alien abductions and other strange events from both a believing and a sceptical perspective whilst keeping an open mind. I'm Stu Jackson, a professional actor and amateur ufologist with a particular interest in the crop circle phenomenon. I'll be debating that otherworldly visitations are real. The truth is out there.
And I'm Neil Kelly. I'm a professional actor as well and used to work for the military as an intelligence analyst. I'll be arguing from a more doubtful point of view. I mean, it's all a bit far-fetched, isn't it?
Welcome everybody to our fourth episode with your usual hosts. I'm Stu Jackson.
And I'm Neil Kelly.
And this week we are talking about the alleged Apollo 11 alien encounter.
Yes.
Now, you've been doing your research since we last spoke about this, Neil.
I've done a bit of research. It seems a bit flimsy, and I kept getting directed back to stories in the Daily Express. Now, for our non-UK listeners, the Daily Express is a tabloid newspaper. Like most of our mainstream media, it's owned by billionaire tax exiles. It's aimed at an elderly demographic and tends to take a, you might say robust, you might say rabidly right-wing view on most social issues. So imagine your sour-faced elderly Brexiter. That's the newspaper for them. It's also renowned for very low standards of journalism, and I can back that up with IPSO reports. So, anyone listening from the Daily Express who wants to take issue with that last remark, I stand by it and I can defend it.
Well, nobody actually doing this podcast with you is going to dispute that. For Americans, it's the Fox News, isn't it?
Or the National Enquirer, but nastier. It's not, the National Enquirer, their stories for fun as much as anything. They're not intended to be taken seriously. The Daily Express, it's the same kind of stories, but they expect their audiences or their readership not to just take it seriously, but to get angry about it. I think that's the main thing reading the Daily Express will do for you. Much like the Daily Mail, it's designed to make you angry and hateful. Yeah. Hate foreigners.
Okay, so you said about it being flimsy. So what? Do you know what? Let's look at this from a chronological perspective. So the Apollo 11 space mission, it was man first setting foot on the moon. It was big and it was important.
Well, I was alive at the time. I was at junior school. It was my just coming up to third. Well, I suppose that'll be year 5 in today's currency. So I was 9 years old, just about to turn 10. And we were all thrilled to be allowed to stay up all night to watch this event. And none of the teachers disapproved. Of course, they actually encouraged us to stay up all night. And I remember also that my idea of space travel was formed by watching programs like Doctor Who, Star Trek, Fireball XL5. So I was a bit disappointed. It all seemed a bit sort of mundane. There were no aliens. There were no ray guns or robots. So it was a bit of a. Perhaps I was a bit too young to appreciate the significance of the events at the time.
Well, I mean, you say that, perhaps there was, but you didn't know at the time.
Perhaps, yeah.
And that's what we're going to be debating.
That's what we're going to be debating.
So, this is obviously like a pretty big conspiracy theory around Apollo 11, not to be confused with the other conspiracy theory, which was that it didn't happen.
Which is the big one, which is the one that is the go-to conspiracy theory.
It certainly is, and there's some. I mean, we're not going to go into that today, but there's some compelling evidence around that. But looking at this alleged alien encounter, so the first part of this happens not that long after they've left the Earth's confines. They're en route to the moon. They're about 1,200 miles up, and Buzz Aldrin looks out the window and sees something.
He draws back the curtain on the little.
Draws back the curtain. There he was, sitting in a tin can. He sees an object, what they estimate to be about 100 miles away, and obviously these are seasoned professionals. I'm inclined to think that if they say it looked to be 100 miles away, all right, I wouldn't expect them to be accurate, but I'd expect them to not be easily fooled by optical illusions and things like that.
Just so I'm clear, was this the first time any of them had been in space, or had they been on previous orbital missions?
Do you know what? That's an excellent question, and I honestly don't know. I don't know, but they were all obviously very experienced pilots. And I have to believe they must have done, at very least, high altitude stuff.
High altitude stuff, but they'd seen these things in space, but they'd never actually been in space before. And the first thing they see is what looks like an alien spacecraft.
Well, they didn't call it that at the time. What they described was an L-shaped object. And there's, I mean, this is on record. They even asked Mission Control, could it have been like the third stage rocket? But the third stage rocket was way too far away by this point for it to have possibly been that, and that's that was confirmed by NASA, by Mission Control.
So was this? Had they used all three stages by this time?
Oh, yes, they had.
So
yes.
The first stage was probably in the ocean by this time. So when you mean the third stage, the final stage, the one nearest to them? Yeah.
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
I mean, that was the question is, could we be seeing this, Houston? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was, could that be what it is? And the answer came back, no, it can't. And this L-shaped object tracked with them for quite some distance, but eventually fell out of view. But it did track with them. Now that in of itself is quite an interesting story, I think.
Yeah, because I read a different story that they saw what looked like three long, slim shapes flying across the moon in a sort of arrowhead formation. That these were like three needles, which they estimated to be about 3 to 4 kilometres long each.
Okay, I'd not read that particular one. Okay, that's an interesting. Was that the Daily Express?
Yeah, that was the Daily Express. Yes.
Okay. Not that I'm going to instantly dismiss that, but that's not a story I'm familiar with.
They have told the truth before.
Oh yes, it does happen on occasion. But yeah, an L-shaped. Now, the thing is, coming back to this L-shaped object, you remember when we talked about the Phoenix Lights?
Yes.
A few episodes ago, and people described a craft that they saw that looked like it was either a big arrowhead or a right angle.
or a V. They described it as a V shaped because of the direction.
A V shape. Absolutely. Now, what happens when you tilt a V on its side? It looks like an L. So I just found that an interesting, a kind of an interesting comparison in that particular one. But we're not experienced in being in space by this point. Optical illusions can happen. That's understandable.
I would think also they would have great difficulty judging the distance of something with the naked eye. Never having been in space before.
I could understand how things could be distorted, but like I say, these are all very experienced pilots. They're not, they've got to be to be doing this job in the very first place. They've got to be, pardon the pun here, grounded people.
They've got to be grounded, but they're used to experienced pilots, but they're used to seeing terrestrial aircraft, and they can judge their distance by how big they look, because they know roughly how big an aircraft should be, how big an enemy fighter is, how big an enemy bomber, how big an airliner is. Then there's not that much variance in size. They would never have seen a craft that was a mile across before. So how could they? What would they have to measure it against if they're seeing something a long way away?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair comment. And if that was where the whole mystery ended and where the story ended,
that would be it'd be a very short podcast.
It would be a very short podcast. However, that's not where it does end up, because obviously, as we know, history. So, spoiler alert for anyone who's not watched the latest episode of Moon Landings yet. They did get to the moon, and they landed safely after some few hairy moments, and they started their moonwalk. Shortly after Neil Armstrong made his famous, small step for a man, giant leap for mankind, they switched over to a private channel, what they called the medical channel, for about 2 minutes. And there is a 2-minute gap in the public record of what was said. Now, this is where the most contention comes about the moon landing, because this has allegedly been, this particular transmission that was on a private channel was allegedly intercepted and heard by ham radios all over the planet. Hundreds of them have come forward with this same testimony, saying that the astronauts had seen several UFOs parked along the edge of the crater.
Well,
that's really interesting.
Even before they landed, there's a kind of gap in the I suppose in the public record that the official story is that as Neil Armstrong was piloting the lunar lander onto the surface, he realised that where he was coming down was not a very good place to land. It was a precarious spot, so he flew horizontally for a couple of kilometres and was, they say, too busy to talk while he was doing it. He was flying this very, very weird, very unstable craft, and that Buzz Aldrin's view of what was happening was out the rear window, I guess. That's where the camera was. It wasn't seeing what Neil Armstrong saw. Now, that's where there's also speculation that he saw, we're about to land down on top of some parked alien spacecraft. We better shuffle along a little bit. But really, it seems more plausible that he just realised, we're coming down on a craggy peak or something, or the edge of a crater. We better move it. It was the Sea of Tranquility where they landed, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Well, that's interesting. So Like I said, there are lots of these ham radio operators who've come forward and said, well, actually, I've got a transcript of what they actually said right here. And, yeah, totally separate people. The transcripts match. So they've come from various sources. And like I say, hundreds of these people coming forward. Most of them didn't transcribe what they were hearing. They were just listening in because it was a cool event, and hey, they're going to listen to the actual astronauts on their very own radio, and how exciting. But yeah, some of them were transcribing it as it was happening, and those different transcriptions match.
So we were talking ham radio here. Amateur radios, they built their own radio sets. Would they have the capability to pick that up? I assume that the reason the Apollo astronauts could communicate by radio back to Earth was because their Earth station had massive aerials and tremendous power behind it to be able to receive a very weak signal and listen. Would an individual person based in another country have had anything like that capability to listen to that? It wasn't like you could pick it up in your...
I'm no electronics or radio expert at all, and perhaps if some of our listeners know the answer to that, they can tweet us and let us know. But I've got to imagine that if you're in the right place on the planet to receive these signals, they are being directed and sent directly at the Earth. And so if you're in the right place, if the atmospheric conditions are right... Yeah, I don't see why not. Why they wouldn't get picked up. I mean, these amateur radio enthusiasts, they're not... It's not someone in a basement with a CB unit. I mean,
it's more than a CB,
really serious.
I understand that, and I understand they talk to people all over the world, but it's just that I've seen the equipment that NASA had to communicate with the astronauts, and I can't believe that an individual would have the wherewithal to have something like that.
But it wasn't just the radio signal that was being transmitted. There was information being transmitted on a whole wide range of frequencies. You're talking about telemetry from the craft. You're talking about the environmental suits were sending readings back to Houston the whole time. So that's why they would need such big equipment, is because it's not just one single band of radio that they're receiving. It's a whole. It might be hundreds. Which got to make a difference.
Yeah, but plus they're sending a video link back.
Exactly. Yeah.
Live. If we accept that the moon landings happened, they had that capability, even though that capability wasn't really in use on Earth at that time.
Well, no. So you're talking about one audio transmission amongst all of that as a comparison in terms of equipment. And as you rightly said, these ham radio people, their hobby was to speak to people on the other side of the planet. Now, in comparison, if they're in a place that is kind of, if you can see the moon in the sky where you are on the planet, that distance is a lot less than going right the way around the world.
Given that there wouldn't have been communications satellites in those days.
Exactly. So, yeah, I'm inclined to think that these people could have had the equipment to have done it. I can see that. But what I'm wondering is what you were saying about the gap in communications as they were coming into land. I've not heard of any transcriptions of any messages that were sent during that time.
No, that was the silent period, which presumably is when they were concentrating on landing the craft safely. And I can imagine that's what they would have been doing at that time. Oh, maybe it was. Hey, we can't land there. There's spacecrafts. Yes.
There's also, I mean, the whole thing. The idea was they landed, they slept, and then they did the moonwalk just after. That was the original plan.
Well,
But of course they landed and wanted to do it straight away.
but wasn't there a time lag of something like 6 hours between landing and actually leaving the module?
There was a time lag, but it wasn't as much as what was planned.
Right. Now,
They
what's
went out much earlier than the original plan. And that historically has been put down to their enthusiasm. Now, again, these are incredibly professional people. They've studied this for a very long period of time and they've trained hard for this. And they know that the slightest thing going wrong can mean just absolute death.
Yes. That
So
actually
why
getting
would
back...
they deviate from the plan?
Yeah, getting back home in one piece depends on them following instructions to the absolute letter. And I mean, Neil Armstrong was a very, very right-brained kind of guy. He would have followed instructions to the letter. He wouldn't have. I don't believe he would have let his enthusiasm get the better of him and do something rash. You know, the first people on the moon. You've got to kind of follow the procedure. You do what you're trained to do. You can't deviate from that. So no, and certainly when they landed back on Earth, their enthusiasm was certainly very muted. That was something else that was picked up. That why are they so closed-mouthed about the whole experience? You would think, oh my god, oh shit, we walked on the moon. We actually walked on the moon. We want to tell everyone about it. We want to tell the world. We're the first people, the only people ever to have done this in human history. But mind you, they were confined to a small capsule for 3 weeks on USS Hornet for quarantine reasons. So I can imagine that kind of took the edge off it a bit.
Well, we'll come on to... I mean, you've raised two very, very good points right there, and we'll definitely be coming on to those. So the transcript of this... It's this missing time that I think is an absolute key, and what happened in those 2 minutes. Now, the transcript that's been put out was Armstrong saying, "What is it? What the hell was it? That's all I want to know." Mission Control responding, "What's their malfunction?" Then the next bit's garbled. Mission Control calling Apollo 11. And Apollo 11 responding, "These babies were huge, sir, enormous. Oh God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecraft out there lined up on the far side of the crater edge. They're on the moon watching us." I mean, that's a bit of a smoking gun, really, isn't it?
It kind of is, if that is the transcript, if that's what was picked up. Has that been officially released, or is that what these ham radio enthusiasts agree on?
So, when it comes to revealing what was said in these 2 minutes, so first of all, NASA denied that there was a missing 2 minutes, and then when they couldn't deny it any further, they blamed it on faulty equipment. That there was a piece of equipment that went faulty. Then, when that was discounted, they said, they turned to their medical channel to talk to us. And that was that. Armstrong himself, he refuses to talk about this completely. And the only time that he's ever made an official comment about those 2 minutes, he says, and I'm going to quote directly, "I have no comment on that, and am uncomfortable discussing the topic." That's a weird thing. I know he has been particularly closed-mouthed, sorry. Not closed-minded. I'm not suggesting Neil Armstrong is closed-minded. No, he's been particularly tight-lipped about the experience. You know, I think he's done one appearance about it to some accountants once. That he spoke about his experiences on the moon. But to say that, he's not denying anything. He's not denying that they turned to the medical channel. and he's uncomfortable talking about it. So either it was some very deeply personal medical issue, or, you know, and he's a bit shy. But again, with professionals of this standing, you know, I don't know. That's a bit of a strange one.
It probably also would have been strange for. I mean, these were all military people, weren't they? They were all Air Force flyers. They wouldn't have been used to broadcasting on a channel which they know the whole world is listening to. I mean, I know that anyone with the right equipment can listen into aircraft and traffic control, but there would have been. If they're flying missions over Vietnam, they're not really expecting that. Well, the Vietnamese will be listening into them, but there's not going to be a PR issue of whatever.
But in response to, why did you turn to your medical channel? Well, I had some medical things to discuss with NASA. What were they? They're of a personal nature, and that's it. That's to say, I've got no comment, and I'm uncomfortable with the topic. Is that I find that really, really bizarre. But there are two other elements to this missing 2 minutes. So within 30 minutes of them landing on the moon, it's widely known there was a rumour spreading around NASA that the crew had a UFO encounter and didn't know what to do about it. That was coming out. Now, if that could be, however, talking about this L-shaped object en route.
Could have been, but I wouldn't have thought, given that had happened a couple of days previously, or when did they lose? It had been tracking them as they made their way towards the moon.
It would have been a long time before. Yeah,
it probably wouldn't have been the first thing on their mind when they're going through the very delicate business of probably the most dangerous part of the mission. They're actually getting onto the lunar surface and then back up again and reconnecting with the orbiter to fly back to Earth.
Well, no, but it can take time for information, even basically for the rumour mill to work. And it might just be the rumours spread and grown from... Because a UFO is an unidentified object in its most basic form. This rumour going around NASA, around mission control, well, around that whole of NASA really, that they'd had a UFO encounter. I'm not suggesting that is necessarily these ships parked on the edge of the crater. Could have been the L-shaped object, but you're not wrong in what you say. You know, the fact that it started about 30 minutes after they landed, that suggests something different. That suggests, that would have been fairly big news. But there is a formal... there was a formal confirmation in 1979. Maurice Chatelain, who was he was former chief of NASA Communication Systems, he confirmed that Armstrong had in fact reported 2 UFOs on the rim of the crater, and to quote him, the encounter was common knowledge in NASA, but nobody talked about it until now. That was in 1979. Now again, that's a hell of a thing for the former chief of NASA Communication Systems to up and say.
It is, yes. But I just wonder, it's such a bizarre encounter that they see these other spacecraft parked some distance away, but then that's it. There's no further encounter. There's no attempt to contact them or by either party. That they just keep their distance and plant their flag and go. I think if I was an extraterrestrial being who kind of regarded the moon as my forward base, and I parked my vehicles there, and some alien creatures arrived in what to me was a very, very primitive craft, and then they bounced around a bit on the moon's surface and then planted a flag and buggered off. I think, well, sod that. I'd probably keep their flag. I'd probably go and help myself to it and examine it. I wouldn't just leave it there.
But what would you do in that situation? It'd be terrifying.
It would, yeah. It would be a very strange situation, a very, very strange standoff.
And it would have to cause some form of PTSD.
You think that they've just landed, they've seen something they can't account for, something that doesn't look right, but then there's no further... it's a little bit odd, a little bit nerve-wracking, but... And it didn't...
You're in a situation that no matter all the training in the world cannot fully prepare you for. It is going to be an incredibly stressful situation.
I mean, they would have heard other accounts of pilots encountering UFOs, some of them not living to tell the tale afterwards.
That would have been a thing.
They would have known about that, but yeah, so suddenly they're seeing their own version of this, that these things are actually parked on the moon.
Well, yeah, you go to be the first man on the moon, and there's 2 spaceships parked there. I mean, that would freak anyone out.
Well, for one thing, they're not going to be able to say we're the first people ever to step on the moon. Actually, someone beat us to it. It's a bit like Christopher Columbus claiming to have discovered America. Well, actually, there were lots of people there when he got there.
Well, there's that, but you'd want to go and have a look. You'd want to take footage. I mean, Mission Control would instruct them to take footage.
You would think,
of
yeah.
it. But you're also conscious that the world is watching you. So yeah, how much time do you think you can get away with going silent without everyone thinking that you're dead? To the world. Yeah, I think 2 minutes would sound about. Go along, get some video footage of it, and then never speak about it again. And yeah, absolutely, that would cause PTSD. I'm confident of it. I mean, you mentioned earlier about them coming back, being sullen, depressed, and that's not the reaction you would expect. Is it?
It's the reaction I would expect from someone who's fished out the sea and put in a quarantine tank for 3 weeks. I imagine that's a bit of a downer on your mood.
They weren't just sullen and depressed for a week or 2 afterwards. It was quite extensive. I mean, Neil Armstrong, did he ever really recover? Like I said, the fact he was so tight-lipped and he'd never do interviews or anything like that.
But what was he like before?
Well, yeah, no, I don't have that answer. That's a fair enough comment. But fast forwarding to events afterwards a little bit further, now there's 2 other things that I find unusual. So one is that the space race was between America and Russia.
Yeah.
And it was about who got there first, and that was really important. And Russia was apparently pouring all this money, all these resources into doing it.
Were they?
Allegedly, yeah. That's one of the things why Kennedy wanted to go, was because he'd heard that they were getting close to doing it.
Well, I thought the impetus was driven not so much by what the Russians might be doing, but what they'd already achieved. I mean, when the Russians put a satellite into orbit in 1957, at that time, America couldn't get a rocket into orbit. Their rockets were just blowing up on the launch pad or exploding shortly after takeoff, providing great firework displays, but they couldn't get something into orbit. There's a very interesting documentary on Netflix, which I can plug for our listeners, called Houston, We Have a Problem. And it's this bizarre story. Yugoslavia actually had a tentative space program And they had managed to launch, with a multi-stage rocket, they'd managed to launch a piglet into the stratosphere. And the piglet had survived. The capsule had come down in the Adriatic, just outside of Italian coastal waters. The Yugoslav Navy had to go and recover it, and it was a bit of a standoff. They were trying to keep this whole thing secret. But the Americans were so desperate, they went, they looked at this program. The Yugoslavs, of course, were under orders to big it up as much as they could. And they sold it to the Americans for $2.5 billion in the end. They haggled them down from $3 billion. And this was a massive, it was a really big deal for Yugoslavia. They went from having this space program that was costing them an awful lot of money that they couldn't really afford for much longer. Suddenly, they've managed to sell it off. They no longer have to bother with it anymore. And they've got enough money, $2.5 billion US dollars in Yugoslavia circa 1960 was enough to raise the standard of living for everyone in the country. Marshal Tito really got a lot of political cred over it. Now, in between the Americans buying it and realising that it didn't work, the Russians put an astronaut, a cosmonaut, into orbit, Yuri Gagarin, which was a second blow. This is the second bit of evidence that, yes, the Soviet Union is a more fertile ground for science and technology and human discovery than the capitalist United States. It was a huge propaganda blow. Under recently declassified Soviet records, we've learned now that Yuri Gagarin wasn't actually the first cosmonaut in orbit. He was about the fifth, but he was the first one to get back to Earth in a presentable condition. The Russians were able to get into space quicker because they had less concern for their astronaut safety. I don't know if I've said this in a previous podcast. The Russians were happy to launch a cosmonaut in a liquid-fueled rocket. The Americans realised how dangerous that was and were developing solid fuels. And that being more dangerous, it's no surprise that they didn't get it right first time. Also, they hadn't worked out how to slow a capsule down enough that they could deploy parachutes and land it either in Kazakhstan or in an ocean somewhere. So the cosmonaut had to actually climb out the capsule, which is going at a tremendous speed, and jump and deploy a personal parachute. So yeah, they did. Yuri Gagarin was the first person to actually come back alive and in one piece and presentable. So the cosmonauts had done that. The Russians, the Soviets, they'd been first to put a satellite up. They'd been first to put a cosmonaut in orbit. So there was an impetus on the Americans to have a first, to be the first to do something else. So they decided, well, we'll be the first to go to the moon. Now, I haven't read much about the Soviets putting much effort into... Obviously, they wanted to keep up with the Americans on most endeavours. But this was a hugely costly thing. And
that's fair enough. But here's the question. Since 1969, why have Russia never bothered?
Because they thought, what's the point? I mean, America, after Apollo 11, I think there were 6 more Apollo launches to the moon. We know Apollo 15 didn't actually get to land, piloted by Tom Hanks. But they went several more times and then gave it up. Well, I can imagine the Soviets not doing this. They're saying, well, what's the point? All the Americans are doing up there is they're sort of playing golf, collecting moon rocks, riding around in their lunar buggies, and that's it. What's the... we don't really see the point of that. I mean, the next logical stage, and what we were all excited about in 1969 was this is the first phase of our journey into space. That now we're on the moon, we will build a moon base up there. We will ferry all the materials up there, build a moon base, and then we will build a large interplanetary craft that will be able to take off more easily from the lunar surface than from Earth's surface. It hasn't got to get through the atmosphere. It'll require a lot less power. You can get a much larger craft into space for a journey to Mars and beyond. That was the thing. But of course, that next step is a huge step. They never came anywhere near that. Building a moon base was just really way more than even the United States could afford. And the political climate changed a lot.
Well, that's fair enough, but once you start down a route, once you've proven the technology, now you say, why would the Russians bother? To prove that they can do it better, very simply, would be a good reason for doing it. To start laying claim to certain areas of the moon. You know, in the same way that we claim territory here on Earth. And you were absolutely right. You just touched on the other thing I was going to say. Was there were these others. We haven't been back to the moon since 1972,
and for good reason.
Well, scientists will tell you there is so much about the moon that we still absolutely do not know. One has to believe that in 50 years the technology has improved rather dramatically. I mean, bear in mind, they went to the moon with a computer that was less powerful than my watch. You know, so I don't know why did they just suddenly stop? There was going to be another one. Apollo 20 was going to happen.
I can think of lots of reasons, and it's to do with the political climate rather than what was on the moon. 1969, 20th of July. America needed this big distraction. They had lots of domestic issues at home. They had the anti-war movement. The war in Vietnam wasn't going very, very well. They'd realised after the Tet Offensive in 1968, we can't militarily win this thing. And of course, that offensive just happened to coincide with Walter Cronkite's visit, the Voice of America. And he saw the Tet Offensive and said, we're not going to win this war. And that was it. And so 1969, they're badly losing a war. There's lots of civil unrest at home over the war, over civil rights, over all sorts of issues. And the moon landing is a great distraction from all that. And they do it a few more times to show that it wasn't a fluke, a one-off. Maybe they saw some things there, well, let's go back and have another look, or more astronauts have been trained for it, they want to go to the moon. But then, you know, in the early 70s, first of all, America gets, if not defeated in Vietnam, I mean, I challenge anyone to say America won the Vietnam War. 1973, Nixon agreed a ceasefire and brought American troops home. That was seen by many Americans as a defeat, the first defeat in Vietnam. The following year, Richard Nixon, rather than face impeachment over the Watergate scandal, he stands down and Ford takes over. Shortly after that, what was happening also at the same time, late 1973, the Yom Kippur War, and Israel for the first time finds itself on the losing side. They suffer massive losses of aircraft, tanks, people, and the United States steps in to prevent Israel being totally wiped out. And this infuriates the Arabs, and particularly Saudi Arabia, the OPEC countries. They decide to punish the West. So they increase oil prices. The price of oil doubles and then doubles again. So by 1974, we're all starting to go into recession. And there are fuel shortages and all sorts of stuff like that. Then 1975, of course, communist forces finally overrun South Vietnam, and that's that. So politically, America's in a real mess. They've totally lost their confidence. And it would seem crass to spend millions, billions of dollars putting someone on the moon when people are starting to starve on their streets.
Okay, I get that, and I can understand why that would have been a hiccup.
Yeah, a bit of a hiccup
in the lunar program, you know, a pause in it. But it wasn't. It just so since then there have been many occasions when politicians would have loved a big distraction, and some would say they created their own to do so. And on top of that, in the 80s, you had, under Reagan, you had the Star Wars program. You know, now under Trump, you know, he's talking about Space Force. So it's not, it isn't that space has suddenly become irrelevant or less of a priority or anything like that, because you are spending ridiculous sums of money on these things to this very day.
Well, some have argued that America won the Cold War by just outspending the USSR. That the Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was way beyond what the Soviets could compete with, and it showed. But these have, and like Trump's Space Force, these have clear military objectives, and as we know, you know, the United States and Britain as well have unlimited funds when it comes to military spending.
Well, yeah,
but no one suggested any advantage on putting a military a military asset on the moon.
But why not? That'd be an ideal place for these programs, unless
I would suggest
we've been warned off.
Well, I would suggest that there's that, we've been warned off, or that we actually don't have the technology to put something on the moon that would be any use in a war.
No, for me, yeah, I think there's more to it. But let's we're at that time in the show when we summarise our thoughts. So for me, something happened. It's record that they were tracked by this L-shaped object en route. You've got the missing 2 minutes, the transcripts from hundreds of people, and of course the statement from Maurice Chatelain, and the subsequent behaviour. To me, that all adds up to, well, conspiracy, yes, but something is being hidden, and it's something to do with UFOs. So I'm pretty convinced that something happened up there. Neil?
I'm easily convinced that something is being hidden, but I'm not sure it's to do with UFOs.
More mundane things.
Yes, more mundane things. The fact that if they were traumatised by encountering these things on the moon, well, didn't stop them going back another time.
Okay, what do you think, listeners? Drop us a tweet, drop us a Facebook message, drop us a post, drop us an email, whatever you like, but do get in touch, and don't forget to let us know if there's any particular subjects that you would like to hear about as well. Don't forget to join us next time when we will be discussing Whitley Strieber, the author of Communion. Thanks, I'm Stu.
I'm Neil.
And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Aliens Explored is a Figo Films production in association with Juicy Falls. Music by Darren Maffucci and editing by Stu Jackson. Find us on Twitter and Facebook by searching Aliens Explored or visit aliensexplored.com.